Good afternoon. Thank you everyone for being here today and for traveling from so far to join us for this important conference. We're so grateful to have such a diverse array of talent and expertise with us this weekend, and we really appreciate you being here with us. John Deskins serves as Assistant Dean for Outreach and Engagement, Director of the Bureau of Business and Economic Research, and as Associate Professor of Economics in the College of Business and Economics at West Virginia University. He leads the Bureau's efforts to serve the state by providing rigorous economic analysis and macroeconomic forecasting to business leaders and policymakers across the state. He received his PhD in economics from the University of Tennessee. Dr. Deskins' academic research has focused on economic development, small business economics, and government tax and expenditure policy, primarily at the U.S. state level. His work has appeared in outlets such as Contemporary Economic Policy, Public Finance Review, Economic Development Quarterly, Small Business Economics, Public Budgeting and Finance, Regional Studies, Annals of Regional Science, Tax Notes, and State Tax Notes, as well as in books published by Cambridge University Press and the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. He has delivered more than 100 speeches to business, government, and community groups, and his quotes have appeared in numerous media outlets such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Bloomberg, CNBC, National Public Radio, and PBS. He has served as principal investigator or co-principal investigator on more than $1 million in funded research. It is my honor and privilege today to introduce you to WVU's very own Dr. John Deskins.
Thanks so much. The dean got the very worst seat with his back towards me. That's a bummer. Of course, you might actually be a better seat. So anyway, great to be here visiting with you folks today. It looks like a really outstanding event that's scheduled today and tomorrow. I wish that I could be here for all of it because a lot of the panels really look very interesting. But anyway, for now, I just thought that I would come and talk about what's happening in our economy in West Virginia and about the challenges that we face and the opportunities that we face. If you're not from West Virginia specifically, many of the issues that I'm going to discuss are certainly applicable to neighboring states in Appalachia as well. Just to start with the most basic facts for our economy, start by talking about jobs. Of course, there is no income or output with jobs, so that's a natural starting place. This figure you can see what's happened to the total number of jobs in our state. The blue line, I have the national job count there for comparison. You can see the really desperate economic situation that our state faced. We saw that peak in 2012, and you see the pretty sharp job losses that we suffered from early 2012 through the later part of 2016. Overall, our state lost about 26,000 jobs over that period. You know, we kept asking ourselves, have we hit bottom? Have we hit bottom? Have we hit bottom? Turns out we finally did hit bottom the later part of 2016. And you know, the good news is for sure is that we've been growing again. We've been adding jobs. So we lost 26,000 jobs, and so far we've added back about 4,500 jobs. That's the glass half full part of the picture. The glass half empty part is that we're probably going to grow at a rate that's slower than what we would hope. We're probably even going to lag the national average in terms of job growth over the coming years. We think that the nation's going to grow about 0.9% per year in terms of employment. West Virginia is going to grow at about 0.7% per year, so a little bit slower than the nation. Overall, with the rate of growth that we expect, we think it's going to take until about 2021 to get West Virginia back to the level of employment that we saw in 2012, that last peak. So glass half full, glass half empty. Clearly, we've hit bottom, we've started growing again, but we should still really have a sense of urgency to make the kinds of changes that we need to get West Virginia growing even more rapidly, because I doubt very many people would argue that we're growing as quickly as we would hope. So it's really hard to understand our state's economy without talking about energy. So let me just talk about what's been happening in energy markets really quickly before we move on, because trends in energy are so dominant in explaining overall trends in the state. And there you can see the really sharp contrast between the two key energy sectors in West Virginia. You can see what's happened with coal, the blue line, and what's happened with gas, the yellow line. Coal production was at 158 million tons in 2008. Fell, of course, very dramatically down to about 80 million tons in 2016. So 158 to 80, that's a drop of nearly 50% in coal production in our state. Just like jobs, we've been asking ourselves, when are we going to hit bottom? When are we going to hit bottom? When are we going to hit bottom? Coal finally did hit bottom in late 2016, and it has bounced back a little bit. Coal bounced back last year from 80 up to about 90 million tons, but we think coal is going to be stable for the next few years. We think production will probably gradually erode more slowly over the longer term, but for the next 2 or 3 or 4 years, we think coal is going to be stable at around that 90 million ton mark, which of course still is really low compared to what we considered normal just a few years ago. With coal, we had this perfect storm of 3 factors that came together at the same time to put tremendous downward pressure on coal demand. See, coal used to have a big cost advantage over gas in terms of electric power generation. Here's the cost of coal, here's the cost of gas. But the regulatory climate has increased the cost of burning coal. It's required substantial capital investments on the part of coal-fired power plants and increased the cost of burning coal. At the same time, the natural gas boom has lowered the cost of burning natural gas. Those two forces have tipped that scale away from coal and in favor of gas from the perspective of electric power production. On top of that, we've had weak international demand for many of those years where you saw a decline. But all 3 of those factors really point to stability now. None of the factors point to a return to growth or a return to where we were in 2008, but they all 3 point to stability at least. Oh, and just one more quick point. All of the losses in coal in West Virginia have occurred in our state's southern coal fields, right? Southern West Virginia is part of the Central Appalachian Coal Basin. Northern West Virginia up here is part of the Northern Appalachian Coal Basin. The drop in demand was national, but then that force, that fundamental economic force, is going to manifest itself in the region of the country where coal mine worker productivity is the lowest. That happens to be Central Appalachia. There we have a lot of coal remaining, but the coal has been mined so aggressively for so many decades, over a century, that the coal that's in the ground is deeper and the seams tend to be thinner, so it's more expensive to get that out of the ground compared to Illinois or Wyoming or Northern Appalachia. So that's where the drop has manifested itself. I'll talk more about that in a minute. But to return back to that slide, you see what's happened with gas. Gas production grew tremendously, more than 40 or around 40% growth in production 4 years in a row, and then about 1.5 years of flatness, and now over the last year or so, production has started to grow again. What happened was production grew so rapidly that our productive capacity just completely outstripped our infrastructure. We didn't have the infrastructure to get the gas to where it needs to be, so we saw a glut emerge. Glut meant that with these infrastructure constraints, price just collapsed, and it didn't make sense for the gas drilling companies to drill anymore. Thus, you see the flatness. But over time, we're seeing infrastructure improve. We're seeing infrastructure improve through pipelines to get the gas to where it needs to be geographically in this country in terms of electric power generation. We're seeing infrastructure improve to get the gas overseas. The export of liquefied natural gas, there's a huge demand for American gas in India, South Korea, Japan, Europe. That infrastructure is improving, and then over the longer term, we expect infrastructure to improve to get the gas to where it needs to be in the chemicals manufacturing industry, where there's a tremendous potential over the long run. But as those different pieces of infrastructure develop, that will open up the gas to additional markets. It'll effectively increase demand for gas. That'll drive up price, and that's the basis of our long-term forecast, which still reflects positive growth. Okay? So those 2 industries are so important in explaining West Virginia's economy. It's really impossible to understand our economy without talking about those industries. Next point, industrial diversification, or the lack thereof. What I have here, the blue line shows you GDP for West Virginia. That's their biggest economic statistic, all right? It represents the total market value of all the stuff we produce. There I have in yellow the GDP for the nation for comparison purposes. Obviously, I'm using an indexed approach to make it easy to follow the numbers. You see, from 2011 through 2016, West Virginia saw no growth in GDP. Right? You can't find any other states that you can say that about. To go a 5-year stretch without seeing any growth in GDP, it was undeniably a really rough patch for a state's economy. On a positive note, you see how the GDP number for 2017 is much stronger. So that's part of the glass half full part of this presentation, is that GDP has started to grow again. That's a good thing. But the green line, which is really my point, it shows GDP for all of our industrial supersectors except energy. All right, because clearly this 50% loss in coal was pulling down total GDP, right? You can't lose 50% of production in this industry that's so important to your state's GDP without seeing overall GDP suffer. So the green line shows you GDP for all supersectors except energy. You'd think the green line would be better than the blue line because it doesn't have energy in it to pull it down. The fact of the matter is, though, the green line is even worse than the blue line. So the problem in West Virginia's economy has been, coal and the suffering that coal has seen. But coal suffered because of national and international trends that are far beyond West Virginia. But the point is, coal suffered, but West Virginia just simply didn't have other industries that were growing to offset the losses in coal. West Virginia just simply did not have other industries that are growing to offset those losses in coal. If I can communicate this slide effectively, this slide really makes a desperate, desperate plea for industrial diversification in our state. We want energy to be strong, but we must have growth in other sectors, manufacturing, tourism, whatever sector. We must have growth in other sectors so that we have a more diversified economy, so that we're not so at risk for when one sector suffers. What's happened to income in our state? Of course, West Virginia is a poor state. Right now, the average West Virginian earns about $75 for every $100 the average American earns. And over the last few years, we've been growing a little bit more slowly than the national figure. We expect to continue to grow a little bit more slowly than the national figure, but not a whole lot. There's not a whole lot of difference there. We expect that 75% figure will probably erode down to 74% maybe the next year or two as the nation grows a little bit more rapidly than West Virginia. But by and large, our income growth is similar to that in the nation. But in this figure, the yellow line shows you overall income growth that's expected in coming years, but the blue bars show you expected growth in the different components of income. As you see, transfer payments, Social Security retirement benefits, Social Security disability benefits, welfare benefits, unemployment benefits, those transfers from Washington are growing much more rapidly. And what we really care about in terms of economic development, wage and salary income, small business income, the lower two bars, those are growing much more slowly than overall income growth. The pie on the left shows you what income composition looked like 15 years ago. The pie on the right shows you what we expect income composition to look like a few years down the road. The red slice shows you transfer payments as a share of total income, and you can see how that transfer payment slice is growing over time as transfer income grows more rapidly than the other components of income. Of course, it's a very good thing that those transfers are there to help people in need. There's a huge need for those transfers, and it's a good thing that that safety net's there. There's a whole bunch of reasons why we're glad that safety net's in place, but at the same time, a large reliance on that safety net and a growing reliance on those sources of income does not bode well for a region's economic potential. I will say, in a second, I'm going to talk about the tremendous variation that we see across West Virginia in terms of economic outcomes from county to county. And I will say for some counties, that pie on the right really looks shocking, how much reliance some counties have on transfer income and how little reliance they have on wage and salary income and small business income. Demographics. Demographics are kind of a less sexy topic, perhaps, compared to other economic issues, but demographics are so important in understanding long-term economic trends. A lot of people talk about the unemployment rate but I just want to tell you real quick, the unemployment rate is virtually a meaningless statistic for West Virginia. Our unemployment rate is about a point higher than the national figure. National figure, low 4% range. Our unemployment's low 5% range. So we're about a point higher than the national figure, but it's virtually a meaningless statistic for our state. The problem is, to be counted as unemployed in the mainstream statistic that you see, you have to be actively looking for work. The problem in West Virginia, and the more accurate descriptor of our labor market, is this statistic, the labor force participation rate. This captures the share of the adult population that wants to work. Whether they have a job or whether they're just looking for a job, doesn't matter. The share of the adult population that wants to work in the first place. This is the more long-term, the more fundamental way of capturing a labor market, whereas the unemployment rate, which is complementary to this statistic, is more short-term and more volatile in nature. But in West Virginia, well, in the nation, you see the labor force participation rate is 63%. 63% of the adults want to work. The ones who don't want to work, some of them are retired, some of them are students, some of them are stay-at-home parents, right? There's plenty of reasons not to be working. But in West Virginia, we're dead last among the 50 states at 53%, falling 10 points behind the nation. Let me be very clear. There is no way possible in the universe that West Virginia can have the kinds of economic outcomes that we hope for, that we deserve, that we want, if we have a labor force participation rate that's dead last in the country, that is a full 10 points behind the nation. There's no way that we can have an income, for example, that's on par with the national figure if we have a full 10% of our adult population on the sidelines compared to the national figure. There's no way. This is, if not one of, this is probably the most important economic challenge that we face in developing our economy over the next 10 or 20 or 30 years, is to try to find ways to get more people in the labor force. So why do we have that gap? Why do we lag the nation by 10 points? It's because of education. It's because of people who would like to work in a perfect world, but they don't even bother to look for work because they know they're not going to get hired, because they know their education or their training or their skill level is not up to par compared to what employers demand. It's because of people who would like to work in a perfect world, but they don't even bother to look for work because they know they're not healthy enough, because they have diabetes or cancer or obesity or whatever. And it's also because of this drug abuse crisis that has gone crazy in West Virginia, right? The deficit that we see here, the reason we're dead last, the reason that we are 10 points behind the nation is because of poor education outcomes, poor health outcomes, and now because of drug abuse. This slide, the fact that labor force participation is so important in explaining our long-term trajectory and in terms of explaining our long-term economic potential, this really makes a desperate plea for more and smarter investment in human capital, in education and health. You all know there's many statistics out there that point to West Virginia's lagging education and health outcomes. Just wanted to show you really quickly. This is, I've already mentioned drug abuse in West Virginia, but drug abuse has been on my mind quite a bit lately. I just spoke at a panel in Charleston this week that focused on the opioid crisis in the state. The blue line, ignore the red line for a second, okay? Blue line shows you opioid overdose deaths in the nation. Used to be 3 per 100,000. This is all gauged by 100,000 per 100,000 population. So our national opioid overdose death rate used to be 3, and it's grown to 10 or 11. It's more than triple. That's a pretty big increase, right? A more than tripling over the course of a decade and a half. In West Virginia, it used to be 2 deaths per 100,000 population. We used to be below the national average. In West Virginia, it's grown to 36. Used to we were slightly below the average. Now, of course, we're the highest state. There's one more state that's also pretty high. I forget which state it is, maybe New Hampshire. But after the first and second states, you can see a big gap in terms of that opioid overdose death rate. This problem has, again, it's one of the 3 factors that feeds into that extremely low labor force participation rate, and it deserves so much attention as we think about overcoming the economic challenges that we face. And just basic fundamental demographics are also very important. This figure shows you some information about the aging of West Virginia. The blue bars show you what we've seen happen over the last decade. The yellow bars show you what we expect to happen in the coming few years. You can see that all age categories in West Virginia are losing people, right? The number of people in each age bracket is falling. It has been falling and is expected to continue to fall, except for the number of people age 65 and over. So this is a big economic challenge that requires a lot of thought in terms of how to break this cycle. Exports. Just another key to understanding our state, moving on from demographics. It's pretty important, pretty interesting to see what's happened to exports in recent years. You see the big growth there, the big drop-off. Just interestingly enough, from 2016 to 2017, exports have grown from $5 billion to $7.5 billion. 50% growth in exports for 2017 over the previous year, but you see that 2017 number is a little bit low compared to the high years that we've seen recently. The volatility is driven by coal, but it's important to keep in mind that we export a lot of really cool and important stuff other than coal: transportation equipment, primary metals, chemicals. We do export a lot of cool stuff, even though coal kind of is the driver behind the volatility. The reason I show this slide is to just say, as we think about economic development, as we think about industries to grow in West Virginia over the long term, industry's export potential is very important to that overall economic development picture. Just really quickly, 7.5 billion exports in 2017. Overall GDP in West Virginia is about 75 billion. Total value of all the stuff we produce is 75 billion, so exports make up 10% of total GDP in the state. So a minute ago, of course, several of you chuckled when I said that we need to diversify our economy because, I mean, I didn't hear you out loud chuckling, but I know in your head you were chuckling, of course, because any idiot can say that. It's really easy to talk about the need to diversify our economy. People talk about that all the time. But the reason you chuckle is because it's a heck of a lot harder to accomplish industrial diversification than it is to just talk about it. It's a big picture, long-run issue. An economy doesn't diversify overnight. It takes decades for that to happen. But the only way to diversify our economy healthily is through entrepreneurship, right? I mean, you know, we don't want government just to sit around and say, okay, we're going to favor industries A and B, and we're going to reject industries C and D. Right? I mean, that's how the Soviets tried to achieve industrial diversification. It has to be up to entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs will have to experiment. Entrepreneurship's messy. Most entrepreneurs don't last after 5 or 10 years. But entrepreneurs will find what doesn't work for our specific economic strengths and weaknesses and challenges and opportunities. But entrepreneurs will also find what does work. And that's the key. So the point to take away is our economy desperately needs diversification. And you can ask people like me. I have people call me all the time asking me, hey, what do you think about the potential for lavender farming in West Virginia? What do you think the potential for hemp farming in West Virginia? People call me all the time. And you know what my answer is to all those questions? I have no idea. I have no idea. Right? I mean, if you guys know me very well, you know I don't have much of an idea about anything. But, you know, I could study those issues and I might be able to come up with a pretty good guess of whether lavender or hemp or whatever else will work for West Virginia. You know, experts can study the issues and put forth a forecast, but ultimately it comes down to an entrepreneur to try it. We have to have entrepreneurs to try and find out what really works and what doesn't. So my point is, as we think about economic development, a central guiding piece of our discussion has to be what can we do to create more of an economic environment, more of a culture, more of a policy environment that is supportive and conducive to small business startup and growth. That has to be a central guiding principle of every economic development discussion in the state. What can we do to create an environment that's more supportive and conducive to small business growth, because it's so important to industrial diversification over the long term. Just really quickly, this figure shows you what has happened to new business births every year. That's the blue line. The red line shows you the number of businesses that have died in West Virginia each year over the past several years. That's the red line. Of course, I have periods of net growth highlighted in blue, periods of net decline highlighted in red. Of course, there's way too much red and not enough blue. We do have too many years where we've seen more deaths than births. But I am encouraged, though, by the fact that at the very least the startups have grown in recent years. And as more data come out, I'm optimistic that maybe we'll see that we get back to the blue, that we get back to a situation where births outweigh deaths. I don't know all the reasons behind this dynamic, but I do know that this issue is so important and it deserves a tremendous amount of focus in our research, in our efforts. Just really quickly, one interesting point about West Virginia, about government. This figure shows you government spending per capita for the nation, which is the yellow line, government spending per capita in West Virginia, which is the blue line. This is for state and local government combined in the state. So, our government's small. If you look at this on a per capita basis, our government is smaller than what we see typically in other states, and that has been the case for at least a couple decades. On a per capita basis, spending in our state is relatively small. If you were to show this in contrast, spending as a share of income, our state is actually larger than the average because we have such a low income, because our income is only 75% of the national average. Our spending figure, when expressed relative to income, it turns out to be a larger number. So whether West Virginia has a large or a small government kind of depends on which measure you use. It's not that one measure is bad and the other measure is good. We just need to understand the full picture. But by per capita terms, we have a relatively small state government. One issue, though, is sometimes you'll hear people quote, state government in West Virginia is large. And that's true by either metric. I was looking at state and local combined because that's the appropriate way to do it. But some people just look at state government and they say that it's large. But the reason that state government's large is because our government in West Virginia is really heavily centralized. This figure shows you state government spending as a share of total state and local combined spending. And you can see where the median is, and you can see that West Virginia is way on your left, indicating that our government's more centralized than most. And some of those that are ahead of us, Vermont is ahead of us, which is obviously tiny geographically. Delaware is ahead of us. It's tiny geographically. It may not make sense to have a whole lot of local government in those states because they're just so small. And North Dakota is ahead of us as well. It's ahead of us as well, and it's obviously so extremely rural. Maybe that makes sense as well for North Dakota. Anyway, so aside from that, West Virginia has a really centralized government structure. Is that good or bad? I have no idea. I have no idea if it's good or bad or not. I do know, or I'm pretty confident, that the reason we have a centralized structure is because it comes down as a vestige of history from the 1930s. Okay? I don't think we've been deliberate about saying that we want a centralized structure in recent decades. I think we just have it because we put it in place decades and decades ago. But I think we should be aware of this fact, and I think we should at least be deliberate. Do we want to have a structure that's way more centralized than most states, or do we want to move in the other direction? I do know, which my final point in just a second is going to be, that we have tremendous, tremendous variation across our regions in terms of economic strengths and weaknesses and so forth. And I'm not absolutely for sure that a centralized structure makes sense with the tremendous amount of regional variation that we have, although it's a multifaceted issue, so I'm not completely for sure. Moving on. Just to close really quickly, even though I quote statewide statistics, and I think it makes sense for us to look at statewide statistics, we cannot ignore the fact that our regions vary so tremendously. Starting with our Southern Coalfields region, here we have seen a Great Depression. 5 of those counties, I have 7 highlighted in the figure, but 5 of those counties, Boone, Logan, Mingo, McDowell, Wyoming, those counties have been in a Great Depression. Those counties have lost at least 25% of their jobs. Mingo County at one point, it's bounced back a little bit, but at one point Mingo County lost over 40% of its jobs. If that's not a Great Depression, I don't know what is. Here, our economic development questions are really the most fundamental, right? What industries work in this area? We're asking really fundamental questions. New River Gorge area has suffered But the area has a lot of potential. It has an urban hub, which helps. It has good connectivity with the two interstates that go through. It has a manufacturing footprint in Raleigh. Even if it's small, it's still some footprint. And it has some tourism opportunity as well in several of the counties. And the counties vary too, even though I have these regions, like in this area, for example, Fayette and Nicholas are much weaker. Raleigh and Greenbrier are much stronger. Metro Valley is a stagnant region. The numbers that I'm showing here show slight declines, but I'm measuring off peak, so I would really describe the Metro Valley as a stagnant region, but a region with tremendous potential with the footprint of manufacturing and chemicals especially, and with the urban core that stretches from Kanawha to, well, from Charleston to Huntington. So region that's been stagnant, but a region with a lot of potential. For this region, employment unchanged. Has the gas boom affected this region or not? I think the counterfactual would be declines in unemployment. The demographics for several of these counties look really weak, so I think it's safe to say that the counterfactual, if it had not been for the gas boom, would be negative employment change. So I think an unchanged employment number actually does reflect positive benefits of the gas boom. But the gas boom is extremely capital intensive. Drilling the wells and exporting the gas through pipelines is extremely capital intensive, does not require very many workers to do that. There are some jobs that have been created, some good paying jobs that we really want, but not nearly as many jobs as we would hope. So what we have here is, if we can draw in downstream activity, if we can see 2 or 3 ethane crackers come in to the region, if we can see an ethane storage hub, then that will really set the stage for many, many, many more downstream manufacturing firms in chemicals, in plastics, and a whole host of areas that could lead to a situation where we're not just drilling the gas and exporting the gas, but a situation where we keep the value in state, where we keep the gas in state and we see the value added occur here versus in Texas or Louisiana or Pennsylvania or Ohio or wherever. Matter of fact, I think our biggest economic development question that we face over the next 20 years is, how much of this downstream activity are we able to land in West Virginia versus how much of this downstream activity goes to our competitor states or the Gulf Coast or wherever. Joe, I gotta hurry here. China Energy. Is everybody familiar with the China Energy announcement? Maybe not that many? Just really quickly, China Energy, one of the biggest companies in the world, a big energy company in China, has recently signed a memorandum of understanding with the West Virginia, Department of Commerce or the governor, or they've signed a memorandum of understanding with West Virginia saying they're going to invest $83 billion in the natural gas industry in West Virginia over the next 20 years. I've already mentioned to you before that GDP for the state is $75 billion. So this is more than the entire GDP of the state. It's a huge, huge, huge number. Are you going to bet your child's future on a memorandum of understanding with the Chinese government? Seriously? Some people are not. Some people are reluctant to shake their heads no. This is a memorandum of understanding with the Chinese government. I'm not going to bet my kid's future on this. Not a single project has been announced. None of the detail is publicly available at all. It's very, very, very murky and opaque at the moment. Every single project that's in the $83 billion has a separate final determination. So all of it could happen, none of it could happen. But even if only half of it happens, it would completely change the landscape for at least a region, if not all of West Virginia. Even if just a quarter of it happens, it would still completely change the landscape. Even if just 1/80th of it happens, it would still be the single largest capital investment in West Virginia's history. So it's not certain. There's a huge amount of uncertainty that hangs over this potential investment, but it sends what I think is a really, really strong signal that we are going to have a lot of success in gathering this downstream activity in West Virginia, and we're not going to lose it all to our competitor states. But anyway, regardless of that, this has to be a key primary focus because it's the biggest economic development question that we face. Eastern Panhandle, completely different. North Central, very different as well. Those regions are much stronger, much more attractive to potential businesses. There's my summary. When I think about West Virginia, I think positive because we have turned the corner and that we are growing. We're moving in the right direction at least. But I think realistically, we still have a lot of challenges to overcome. I think about people because that labor force participation is challenge number one. It deserves tremendous, tremendous focus and investment. I think about good government, I think about the regional variation that we have, and I think about tailoring economic development strategies appropriate to each region and not pursuing a one-size-fits-all strategy. I think about the extreme importance of entrepreneurship in finding the right industrial mix for West Virginia over the long term, and you can see the others there. Don't want to keep you from your 1:30 session. Thanks so much for having me. Really enjoyed coming over and visiting. If you have questions, you can just grab me, but I won't hold you up from your next section. Thanks, it was fast. That's your minute.